The physician's hands trembled as he set down the bowl, and Chen Meilin understood that she was going to die. She had been raised in a household where the language of silence spoke louder than words, where a servant's averted eyes or a pause before answering conveyed more truth than any declaration. The physician, a man of 50 years who had attended her father's family for 2 decades, could not meet her gaze. His fingers, stained with the residue of the herbal paste he had just examined, curled and uncurled against his robe. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he wished he did not have to give. "The substance found in your system is quite rare, my lady," he said. "A poison derived from the seeds of the autumn crocus, mixed with extract of monkshood root. The preparation is sophisticated." Meilin sat very still on the carved wooden stool in her chambers. Through the latticed window, she could hear the distant sound of her stepmother's maids laughing in the courtyard. It was the 20th day of the 4th month, and the peonies in the garden had just begun to bloom, great heavy flowers in shades of coral and cream that her mother had planted before Meilin was born. "How long?" she asked. The physician's throat worked. 3 months, perhaps 4, if you are strong. "And if I'm treated?" "My lady." He looked at her then, and she saw something close to grief in his lined face. "The poison was administered over time. It has already done its work in your blood and bones. There is no treatment that can reverse what has been set in motion. I can offer herbs to ease the pain that will come, but I cannot offer you life." After he left, Meilin sat alone in the silence of her room and took inventory of what she knew. She was 22 years old. She was the legitimate daughter of Chen Meilin, Minister of Rights, born to his first wife, Lady Shen, who had died when Meilin was 7. She had one younger half-brother, Chen Xian, born to her father's second wife, Lady Tang, who had entered the household 6 months after her mother's death. She had lived her entire life in this compound in the capital, within these walls where every flowering tree and carved stone pillar held some memory of her mother's gentle presence. And now someone had poisoned her with such patience and calculation that by the time the symptoms became undeniable, the fatigue, the occasional tremor in her hands, the strange ache in her bones, it was already far too late. The knowledge settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She waited for fear, for rage, for the violent uprising of emotion that such news should provoke. Instead, what she felt was a strange, clarifying coldness. In 3 months, perhaps 4, she would be dead. The walls of propriety and caution that had circumscribed her entire life. The careful dance of being a legitimate daughter in a household where her stepmother held all the soft power, where her father's love was real but distant, where her very existence was both honored and resented. All of it suddenly seemed as insubstantial as paper. She had been dying slowly for months, careful and courteous and obedient, and she had not even known it. She would not die the same way. That evening, she went to find her brother. Chen Xian was in the library, bent over a text on military strategy, his young face serious in the lamplight. At 16, he had their father's strong features, but none of his reserve. Where their father was measured and diplomatic, Xian burned with uncomplicated emotion. He loved fiercely and hated with equal fervor, and he had loved Meilin from the moment he was old enough to toddle after her through the courtyards of their home. He looked up when she entered, and his face brightened with immediate pleasure. "Elder sister, I was hoping you would come. I wanted to ask your opinion on this passage about siege warfare. The author claims that—" He stopped. His smile faded as he studied her face. "What's happened?" he asked, rising from his seat. "You look strange," she offered. "Changed?" "Frightened," he said quietly. "You never look frightened." Meilin closed the door behind her and moved to sit in the chair opposite his desk. The library was her favorite room in the compound. It had been her mother's favorite too. Lady Shen had been an educated woman, unusual for her time, and she had filled these shelves with texts on poetry, philosophy, and history. After her death, the room had become a kind of sanctuary for Meilin, a place where she could still feel the echo of her mother's presence. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to listen carefully, without interrupting." She watched his face as she told him, watched the confusion give way to disbelief, then horror, then a rage so pure and immediate that he was on his feet before she had finished, his chair clattering backward. "Who?" The word was barely more than a snarl, Tell me who did this, and I will— You will do nothing, Meilin said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his fury. Not yet. Sit down, Zian. He stared at her, chest heaving, hands clenched into fists. Then, with visible effort, he righted his chair and sat. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. How can you be so calm, he demanded. They've killed you. Someone in this house has killed you, and you sit there as if I have only 3 months to live and cannot afford to waste them on useless rage. She kept her voice gentle because she understood what he was feeling. The love between them had always been uncomplicated, a bright thread of warmth in a household where affection was more often strategic than genuine. When Lady Tang had entered the house as their father's new wife, already pregnant with Zian, Meilin had been prepared to resent the child. Instead, she had found herself fiercely protective of the solemn, watchful baby who seemed to instinctively know which of the household servants could be trusted, and which would report his every childhood transgression to his mother. As he grew, that instinct had sharpened into a keen understanding of the household's dynamics. He knew that his mother, Lady Tang, was ambitious and shrewd, that she had married their father with clear-eyed calculation and managed his household with ruthless efficiency. He knew that many of the servants who smiled at him carried information back to his mother, and he knew that Meilin, as the legitimate daughter of the first wife, occupied a position that was both honored and deeply precarious. What he had never fully understood until now was how precarious it truly was. I need to think clearly, Meilin continued. The physician said the poison was administered over time, months, perhaps longer. That means it was added to something I consumed regularly, my tea most likely, or perhaps my meals. Mother's maids prepare your tea, Zian said, his voice hollow. They have done so since she took over management of the household. Meilin nodded slowly. She had known this, of course, had known it with the part of her mind that understood household politics, that had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of being the legitimate daughter in a house where the second wife held all the practical power. But she had told herself that her stepmother's coldness was simply that, coldness, not active malice. That Lady Tang's obvious preference for advancing Zian's prospects over Meilin's was natural maternal instinct, not evidence of deeper hostility. She had been, she realized now, extraordinarily naive. I don't believe it, Zian said suddenly. My mother is calculating, yes, and ambitious, but murder, her own stepdaughter? What would she gain? Your death would bring shame to our house, investigations, suspicion. Unless it appeared to be natural, Meilin said quietly, a slow decline from some mysterious illness. By the time anyone thought to test for poison, it would be too late. And who would suspect? I am an unmarried daughter, past the prime age for marriage. I occupy rooms and consume resources that could be better used for you. When I die, the household will mourn appropriately, and then life will continue. Father will have one less daughter to find a match for. The inheritance will flow more cleanly to you. I don't want any inheritance if it costs your life, Zian's voice cracked. You're my sister. You're the only person in this whole cursed house who ever treated me like I mattered for myself, not just as mother's son or father's heir. When I was 8 and broke father's favorite inkstone, you took the blame. When I was 12 and wanted to study poetry instead of strategy, you convinced father it would make me a more well-rounded scholar. You've protected me my entire life. Yes, Meilin said simply. And now I need you to help me. He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. Anything. Tell me what to do. First, we need to be certain. The physician's findings suggest poison, but they don't tell us who administered it or how. I need evidence. And then I will decide what to do with the time I have left. The way she said it made Zian look at her more closely. There was something different in her expression, something he had never seen before. His sister had always been careful, measured, diplomatic, qualities that had helped her survive in a household where she was both elevated and vulnerable. But the woman sitting across from him now had the look of someone who had shed a heavy burden. There was a lightness to her, a dangerous clarity. You're going to do something, he said slowly, something that would have been unthinkable before. I'm going to stop being afraid, Meilin said. Fear only matters if you have a future to protect. Over the next week, Meilin became a student of her own household in a way she had never been before. She paid attention to things she had previously accepted as routine: who prepared her meals, Who carried her tea? Who had access to her chambers at what times? She asked Xian to quietly investigate the servants, to learn which ones had been elevated in status or received unusual gifts in recent months. She herself began to watch Lady Tang with new eyes. Her stepmother was a handsome woman of 40, with the kind of beauty that had deepened rather than faded with age. She managed the Chen household with impressive efficiency, overseeing everything from the menu for her husband's important dinners to the education of the younger servants. She was respected by the household staff, feared by those who crossed her, and admired in society for her skillful navigation of the capital's complex social hierarchies. She had also, Meilin realized, never once voluntarily sought out Meilin's company. In 15 years of living in the same household, Lady Tang had never invited her stepdaughter to share tea, never asked her opinion on household matters, never shown any interest in her life, beyond the bare minimum required by propriety. When Meilin entered a room, Lady Tang's gaze would pass over her with the same attention one might give to a piece of furniture, acknowledged, but not truly seen. Meilin had told herself this was simply the distance between stepmother and stepdaughter, the natural coolness that existed when a second wife replaced a beloved first. She had not recognized it for what it was: absolute indifference to her existence, and from indifference to malice, she was learning, was not such a great distance. On the 8th day after the physician's visit, Xian came to her rooms with a paper clutched in his hand. His face was pale with fury. "I found this in Mother's correspondence," he said, thrusting it at her, "hidden in her private writing desk. I shouldn't have looked, but after what you told me, I had to." Meilin took the paper. It was a letter, written in an elegant hand she did not recognize. The contents made her blood run cold. The matter proceeds as discussed. The young lady's health continues to decline in a manner that will raise no suspicion. By the summer's end, the obstacle will be removed, and the household's resources can be properly directed to their legitimate purpose. The tincture will be delivered as arranged. There was no signature, no explicit mention of names, but the meaning was unmistakable. "The tincture," Meilin said softly. "That's what the physician called it, the poison." Xian was pacing now, moving like a caged animal. "We have to take this to Father. Show him what she's done. He'll have her arrested, exiled, executed." "We will do no such thing," he stopped, staring at her. "You can't be serious. This is evidence. This proves she's behind your murder. This proves someone sent a carefully worded letter that could refer to any number of things. The young lady could be anyone. Obstacle removed. Could mean arranging a marriage, a relocation. There's no explicit mention of poison, no naming of names. A clever lawyer, and Lady Tang would certainly hire the best, could argue we are the ones reading malice into innocent correspondence. But the physician's testimony, the physician found poison in my system. He cannot prove how it got there or who administered it. All we have is suspicion and a vaguely worded letter. It's not enough." Xian slammed his fist against the wall, making the hanging scroll rattle. "Then what? We do nothing? We let her get away with killing you?" "No." Meilin set the letter down carefully on her desk. "We let her think she has gotten away with it. And while she believes herself safe, I will use the time I have left to do something far more valuable than seeking revenge." "What could be more valuable than justice?" "Truth," Meilin said. "About why she wants me dead. About what secret she is protecting. Because this is not simply about household resources or inheritance, Xian. This is something deeper." She had been thinking about this for days, since the first shock of the diagnosis had faded. Lady Tang was shrewd and ambitious, yes, but she was not needlessly cruel. Everything she did served a purpose. Meilin's death served a purpose. But what purpose required murder rather than simply arranging a marriage that would remove Meilin from the household? What was Meilin's existence preventing that her absence would enable? The answer, she was becoming convinced, had something to do with legitimacy. "Tell me about your birth," she said to Xian suddenly. "Everything you know about it." He blinked at the change in subject. "I was born here, in this compound, the 14th day of the 9th month. Mother was in labor for hours. She tells the story sometimes, how difficult it was, how she nearly died bringing me into the world." "Who attended the birth?" "The household midwives, presumably." "Why?" "And what do you know about your betrothal to the magistrate's daughter?" the one that was arranged when you were an infant. It was cancelled when I was 5. Father said the magistrate's family had fallen into disfavor, that it was no longer a suitable match. Mother was furious, I remember that much. She and father argued about it for weeks. Meilin turned this information over in her mind. She remembered that time too. She had been 12 years old enough to understand that the raised voices behind her father's study door meant trouble, but too young to understand the stakes. Lady Tang had been icily angry for months afterward, and the household had walked on eggshells around her mood. What if, she said slowly, there was something about your birth that Lady Tang needs to keep hidden? Something that your betrothal to the magistrate's daughter would have revealed? Like what? I'm my father's legitimate son, born in wedlock to his legal second wife. What could possibly? He stopped. They looked at each other. Unless I'm not, Xian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Unless something about my birth was irregular. You are my father's son, Meilin said firmly. You look like him. You have his temperament in many ways. But the question of legitimacy isn't always about parentage. It can be about timing, about whether the marriage rites were properly performed, about whether certain legal requirements were met. And how would this connect to you? I am the legitimate daughter of the first wife. As long as I live, I am a witness to the household's history. I was here when Lady Tang entered this house. I was 7 years old, but I was old enough to remember things, to notice things. Like what? Meilin closed her eyes, reaching back into memory. Her mother had died in the 3rd month. The funeral rites had been elaborate, befitting the first wife of a minister. Then there had been the mourning period, 3 months during which the household had been somber and quiet, and Meilin had been numb with grief. And then, with almost unseemly haste, her father had announced his intention to remarry. Lady Tang entered the household in the 6th month, she said. I remember because the peonies were blooming, just as they are now. She was already pregnant. Father presented it as a blessing, a sign that heaven approved the match. But now that I think about it, 3 months is very early for a pregnancy to be visibly confirmed. Most women would not yet be showing. You think she was pregnant before she married father? I think it's possible. And if that's true, then the question becomes, whose child was she carrying? Xian's face had gone white. If I'm not father's son. You are father's son, Meilin interrupted. I told you you look like him. But if Lady Tang was already pregnant when she married him, even by a few weeks, it would raise questions about the legitimacy of the marriage itself. And if those questions were raised when you were an infant, betrothed to the magistrate's daughter, the magistrate's family would have investigated, Xian finished, to ensure they were making a proper match. And if they discovered any irregularity, it would have ruined mother's position, made her vulnerable to being set aside as a wife, made me vulnerable to being disinherited. So the betrothal was cancelled, Meilin said. And for 15 years, Lady Tang has maintained her position through careful management and social influence. But I am still here, still a witness to that time. Old enough to remember the timing, to testify to it if anyone ever asked the right questions. She's killing you to silence you. She's killing me to erase the last inconvenient memory. With me gone, there's no one left who remembers the exact timeline of her arrival and your birth. Father certainly doesn't keep track of such things. He was grieving, distracted. The servants from that time have mostly been replaced with her own people. I am the last thread connecting the present to a past she needs to bury. Xian sat down heavily, his young face suddenly looking much older. What do we do? Meilin smiled, and it was not a kind expression. We go looking for the truth, and then we decide what to do with it. The investigation took 2 weeks, and it required calling in favors Meilin had not known she possessed. There was a cousin on her mother's side, a minor official in the records office, who was willing to search the archives for the marriage documents. There was a retired servant who had attended her mother and now lived outside the city with her daughter. Xian traveled to visit her and returned with the old woman's sworn statement about the dates of Lady Tang's arrival and the visible state of her pregnancy. There was even, most damning of all, a midwife who had been present at Xian's birth, and who, for a sum of money that Meilin paid from her mother's jewelry, was willing to testify that the child had been delivered a full month earlier than Lady Tang had claimed. The evidence, when assembled, told a clear story. Lady Tang had been pregnant before her marriage to Chen Meilin. Only by a few weeks, perhaps, enough that the child could plausibly be his, especially given Xian's resemblance to his father. But the timing was irregular enough that if it were officially questioned, if the dates were examined too closely, it would cast doubt on the marriage's propriety, and thus on Xian's status as a legitimate heir. Meilin sat in her mother's library with the evidence spread before her, and felt a curious lack of triumph. She had expected to feel vindicated, perhaps, or righteously angry. Instead, she felt tired. Her body had begun to betray her in small ways. The tremors in her hands were more frequent now, and there was a persistent ache in her bones that the physician's herbs could only dull, not eliminate. She had perhaps 2 months left, maybe less. "We take this to father," Xian said. He had barely left her side since they had begun the investigation, protective and fierce. "We show him what she's done. All of it, the poison, the cover-up, everything. And what do you think he'll do? Exile her, divorce her, have her tried for attempted murder?" "Perhaps," Meilin looked at her brother's earnest face. "Or perhaps he will look at this evidence. Look at you, his son, his heir, the boy he has raised and educated and planned his legacy around. And he will decide that the evidence is inconclusive, that the timing is close enough to be legitimate, that the testimony of a retired servant and an old midwife cannot be trusted, that it would be too damaging to the family's reputation to admit that the second wife might have trapped him into marriage with another man's child." "You're saying he would protect her after she poisoned you?" "I'm saying he would protect himself. And you, because you are his son Xian, in every way that matters to him. You carry his name. You will carry on his legacy. Publicly questioning your legitimacy would destroy everything he has built. And he is, above all else, a man who values stability and reputation. Then we go to the authorities directly, bypass him entirely, and create a public scandal that destroys our family's standing, that makes you unmarriageable and ruins your future." "No." She said it gently but firmly. "That's not justice. That's just spreading the damage wider." Xian's frustration was palpable. "Then what was the point of all this? Why did we gather evidence if we're not going to use it?" "Because knowledge is a form of power," Meilin said. "Even if we never speak it aloud, especially if we never speak it aloud." She stood, wincing slightly at the ache in her bones, and moved to the window. The peonies in the garden were in full bloom now, heavy and lush. Her mother had planted them the year before Meilin was born, wanting her daughter to grow up surrounded by beauty. Lady Shen had been a gentle woman, unsuited in many ways to the sharp politics of the capital's elite families. But she had understood something important about beauty and memory, that the things we plant and nurture outlast us, that they become a kind of testament to our existence. "I want to speak to father," Meilin said. "Alone." Her father received her in his study, a severe room lined with books and scrolls, dominated by a large desk of dark wood. Chen Meilin was 58 years old, his hair more gray than black, his face lined with the accumulated weight of 3 decades in government service. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or discomfort. He so rarely saw her these days. It was easy to forget that she was there, quietly living her life in the women's quarters, making no demands on his time or attention. "Daughter," he said, setting down his brush, "I was sorry to hear of your illness. The physician tells me he has provided herbs to ease your discomfort." "He has been very kind," Meilin said. She sat without being invited, watching her father's eyebrows rise slightly at the breach of etiquette. "But we both know the herbs are a courtesy. I am dying, father. I have perhaps 2 months left to live." His face went carefully blank. "The physician did not tell me it was so serious." "The physician told you exactly what Lady Tang instructed him to tell you, that I was suffering from a mysterious decline, but that there was no cause for immediate alarm. She has managed even this with her characteristic efficiency." "Meilin," his voice held a warning. "You should not speak of your stepmother with such disrespect." "She has poisoned me," Meilin said, her voice calm and even. "Over a period of months, someone has been adding a slow-acting poison to my tea. The physician confirmed it when I asked him to test for it specifically. By the time the symptoms became obvious, it was too late for treatment." Chen Meilin sat very still. She could see him processing this information, see the careful calculation behind his eyes, He was a politician to his core, trained to think 3 moves ahead, to consider consequences and implications before reacting. "That is a serious accusation," he said finally. "Do you have proof?" "I have the physician's testimony. I have evidence of the means and opportunity. I have a letter found among Lady Tang's correspondence that references removing an obstacle and mentions a tincture. I have testimony from servants about who had access to my chambers and my meals. Would you like to see it?" "No." He said it quickly, and she understood. If he saw the evidence, he would have to act on it. If he remained ignorant, he could claim he had never known, could let her death pass as a tragedy rather than a crime that would tear his household apart. "I thought not," she said softly. "But I wanted you to know that I know that your daughter did not die in ignorant confusion, believing herself the victim of some cruel natural illness. I know exactly what was done to me and why." Her father's hands, resting on his desk, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why?" he asked. "What reason could Lady Tang possibly have to harm you?" "Because I remember things she would prefer forgotten. Because I was 7 years old when she entered this house, old enough to recall the timing of her arrival and Xian's birth. Because I am an inconvenient witness to a past that raises uncomfortable questions about legitimacy and propriety." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, followed immediately by denial. "Xian is my son." "Yes," Meilin agreed. "He is. I have no doubt of that. But Lady Tang was already pregnant when she married you, wasn't she? Only by a few weeks, perhaps. Close enough that the child could be passed off as conceived in wedlock. But close enough that if anyone examined the dates carefully, questions would be raised. This is speculation, malicious gossip. This is the truth you have chosen not to examine too closely. Because it was easier to accept Lady Tang's story, to welcome the convenient son she bore you, to move forward without asking questions. And it has worked out well for you, hasn't it? Xian is everything you hoped for in an heir. Intelligent, capable, loyal. Why should it matter if the marriage was somewhat irregular in its timing? "It does not matter," her father said firmly. "Xian is legitimate. I have acknowledged him as my son. That is the end of it." "It would be," Meilin said, "except that your second wife has decided that my continued existence is a threat to that legitimacy. And rather than trust in your protection or the strength of her position, she has chosen to have me murdered." The word hung in the air between them. Murder, not poisoned, not killed, murdered. A crime that demanded justice, punishment, action. Chen Meilin looked at his daughter, and for a moment, something like genuine anguish crossed his face. "What do you want me to do, Meilin? Tell me. If I investigate Lady Tang, if I accuse her publicly, it will destroy this family. The scandal will ruin Xian's prospects. Everything I have built will crumble." "I know," Meilin said. "I'm not asking you to investigate her. I'm not asking you to punish her. I'm not even asking you to believe me, though we both know you do." "Then what are you asking?" "Nothing." She smiled, and it was a sad expression. "I'm not asking you for anything, Father. I'm simply telling you that I know. I know what she did. I know why. And I know that you are choosing your household stability over your daughter's life. I wanted you to understand that when I die, it will not be some mysterious tragedy. It will be a choice you made." She stood to leave. Her father remained seated, his face gray. "I loved your mother," he said quietly. "I grieve her still." "I know you do," Meilin replied. "But you loved your position more. You always have. I understand that now. I'm not angry about it anymore. I simply wanted you to know that I understand." She left him there, surrounded by his books and his carefully maintained reputation. And she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Xian was waiting for her in the garden, pacing among the peonies. He turned as she approached, his face anxious. "Well, he knows," Meilin said. "He knows, and he will do nothing, as I expected." "Then we do nothing either," she said firmly. "Xian, listen to me. I have perhaps 2 months left to live. I can spend that time trying to bring down Lady Tang, to force Father to act, to create a scandal that will damage our family for generations. Or I can spend it doing something more valuable." What could be more valuable than justice? It was the same question he had asked before, and this time Meilin had a different answer. "Peace," she said. "These last months of my life, I don't want to spend them in bitterness and rage. I want to spend them experiencing everything I've been too cautious to experience before. I want to write the poetry I've been too afraid to show anyone. I want to walk through the city without a chaperone. I want to speak my mind without worrying about propriety. I want to live, Zian. Truly live. For the first time and the last time, he stared at her. You're giving up on revenge. I'm choosing something else instead. Revenge would require me to care deeply about the future, about punishment, about consequences, about teaching lessons. But I have no future. All I have is now. And I will not waste it on hatred. She's going to win, Zian said, his voice breaking. She's going to kill you and face no consequences, and that's not fair. No, Meilin agreed. It's not fair, but fairness is not something I can afford to wait for. She took his hands in hers, feeling the tremor in her own fingers. I need you to do something for me. After I'm gone, I need you to live well, to be the kind of man who honors truth even when it's inconvenient, to build the kind of household where people are valued for themselves, not for their strategic utility. Can you do that? Don't, he said desperately. Don't talk about after you're gone. There has to be something we can do. Some healer we haven't consulted, some treatment. There isn't. I've accepted that. Now I need you to accept it too. He pulled her into an embrace, and she felt him shaking with silent sobs. She held him until he calmed. This brother who had been the one uncomplicated love of her life, and she memorized the feeling of being held by someone who loved her without agenda or calculation. I don't know how to let you go, he whispered. You'll learn, she said gently. Grief teaches us many things, but Zian, promise me you won't let it make you bitter. Promise me you won't spend your life trying to avenge me. How can I promise that? Because I'm asking you to. Because the best way to honor my memory is not to destroy the family, but to make it better. To be the kind of heir who brings justice and kindness to his position. To remember that legitimacy isn't just about birth status. It's about how you treat the people who depend on you. He pulled back, wiping his eyes. You're asking me to just forget what she did? I'm asking you to live beyond it. There's a difference. The next 6 weeks were the most vivid of Meilin's life. She wrote poetry and showed it to a literary society that met in the eastern part of the city, and was gratified to hear her work praised by scholars who had no idea who she was. She walked through the markets and temples without a chaperone, and felt the strange freedom of moving through the world as just another woman, not as the Chen family's legitimate daughter. She spent long afternoons with Zian, teaching him everything she had learned about managing a household, about politics and people, about the subtle arts of reading what was not being said. And she watched Lady Tang, who watched her in return with carefully concealed concern. Her stepmother had expected her to die quietly, to fade gradually away. Instead, Meilin was more present than she had been in years, dining with the family, appearing at social functions, visibly alive and relatively healthy, despite the poison working through her system. It must have been maddening for Lady Tang, but she could do nothing without revealing her hand. So she smiled her cold smile at family dinners, and she made polite inquiries about Meilin's health, and she waited for the poison to complete its work. Meilin found a curious satisfaction in this. She was dying, yes, but she was dying on her own terms, squeezing every possible drop of life from the time she had left. The poison might take her body, but it would not take her spirit. The pain grew worse as the weeks passed. The physician increased the dosage of his herbs, but there was only so much they could do. Meilin's hands shook constantly now, and her bones ached with a deep, persistent pain that made walking difficult. She grew thin, her face taking on the hollowed look of serious illness, but she did not retreat to her chambers to die in private. She continued to appear, to participate, to live. On the evening of the 53rd day after the physician's diagnosis, Meilin sat in her mother's garden and watched the peonies beginning to fade. The great blooms were past their peak now, the petals starting to drop, the colors softening from vibrant coral to pale pink. In another week, they would be gone entirely, leaving only green foliage behind. It seemed fitting somehow. She and the peonies were on the same timeline. Zian found her there as the sun was setting. He had been her constant companion in these final weeks, canceling his studies and social obligations to spend time with her. Lady Tang had commented on this, her voice carrying a note of disapproval. What would people think, the heir spending all his time with his dying sister? But Zian had ignored her. He no longer even pretended to defer to his mother's wishes. The knowledge of what she had done had created an unbridgeable distance between them. "The physician was here earlier," he said, sitting beside her on the stone bench. "He said it won't be much longer. Days, perhaps. A week at most." "I know," Meilin said. She had felt the change in her body, the way it was beginning to surrender. The pain was nearly constant now, barely managed by the herbs. Her heart fluttered irregularly in her chest. Her vision sometimes blurred at the edges. "I'm ready." "I'm not," Zian said, his voice raw. "I'll never be ready." They sat in silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. The garden was peaceful, the air filled with the sweet scent of the dying peonies. "I've been thinking about what you said," Zian finally spoke. "About legitimacy not being just about birth status. About how it's about how you treat people. And I've decided something. After you're gone, I'm going to commission a memorial stone for Mother. For your mother, I mean, for Lady Chen. Father never did that, did he? He remarried so quickly, moved on so efficiently. But she deserves to be remembered. Her kindness deserves to be commemorated." Meilin felt tears prick her eyes. She would have liked that. "And I'm going to establish a scholarship in your name, for girls who want to study poetry and literature, so that other daughters can have the education you had to fight for." "Zian, I need to do something," he said fiercely. "I need to know that your life mattered, that your death isn't just going to be forgotten, smoothed over like my mother smooths over everything inconvenient." "My life did matter," Meilin said gently. "It mattered to you, and that's enough." But she was touched by his plans, by the way he was already thinking about how to honor her memory. He would make a good minister someday, she thought. A good head of household? He had learned the important lessons. 3 days later, Meilin woke to find she could no longer stand. Her legs would not support her weight. Zian carried her to her bed, his face wet with tears, and the physician came and administered stronger herbs that made everything soft and distant. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Zian's presence beside her bed, of her father visiting once and standing awkwardly near the door, of Lady Tang appearing briefly and then leaving quickly, perhaps unable to face the concrete evidence of what she had done. On what the physician said would be her last evening, Meilin asked Zian to carry her to the garden one final time. He did, lifting her carefully, shocked by how light she had become. He settled her on the stone bench, where she and her mother used to sit, and he wrapped blankets around her thin shoulders. The peonies were gone now, only their foliage remained, green and resilient. But new buds were already forming at the base of the plants, next year's flowers preparing themselves in the darkness of the soil. "They'll bloom again," Meilin said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "After I'm gone, every spring. Your children will see them, your grandchildren. I'll make sure they're tended," Zian promised. "I'll make sure they're never neglected." "Good." She leaned against him, feeling very tired now. The pain had faded to a distant ache, the herbs finally doing their work. "Zian, you have to let me go now." "I don't know how." "Yes, you do. You've been preparing for this for weeks. You're strong enough." "I don't want to be strong enough." "I know, but you are anyway." She managed a smile. "You're going to do remarkable things. You're going to be the kind of man this family needs, the kind of man I would have been proud to call brother." "You already are proud of me." "I am. So very proud." She closed her eyes. The garden smelled like earth and growing things, like life continuing, indifferent to individual endings. She thought of her mother, who had planted these peonies knowing she might not see them bloom. She thought of all the women who had planted and tended and nurtured, creating beauty that would outlast them. She had not gotten justice. She had not gotten revenge. Lady Tang would face no consequences for her actions. Her father would continue his career with his reputation intact. The household would mourn appropriately and then move on. But Zian would remember. Zian would carry the truth with him, would let it shape him into something better than what he might have been. And that, Meilin thought, was its own kind of victory. Not the satisfying, dramatic kind, but the kind that lasted. She felt very peaceful. The poison had taken her body, but it had also freed her spirit. These last weeks had been more vivid, more true, more wholly lived than all the careful years that preceded them. She had stopped being afraid. She had stopped performing the careful dance of propriety that had constrained her entire life. She had become, in dying, more fully herself than she had ever been while living safely. Meilin, Xian said urgently, "Sister, stay with me." "I am," she whispered. "I'm right here." But she was also somewhere else. Somewhere peaceful, somewhere her mother was waiting, and the peonies bloomed eternally, and fear was just a word with no power to constrain. She died as the sun set, held in her brother's arms, in the garden her mother had planted. She died knowing she was loved. And she died free. Xian held her for a long time after, even when the servants came and gently told him it was time to let her go. He held her and wept, and made promises to her still form about the kind of man he would become, the kind of household he would build. Eventually, he let them take her body away to be prepared for burial. He stood in the empty garden, surrounded by the green leaves of the peonies, and he made himself remember the exact timeline of his mother's arrival and his birth, the letter they had found, the evidence they had gathered, the truth his sister had uncovered. He would never speak it aloud. He had promised her he would not destroy the family in pursuit of revenge, but he would never forget it either. And when the time came for him to inherit his father's position, when he became head of the Chen household, he would remember what his sister had taught him about legitimacy and honor and the price of silence. Lady Tang attended the funeral, appropriately somber, and spoke graceful words about her departed stepdaughter. Chen Baowen commissioned an elaborate tomb and paid for proper ceremonies. The household mourned with the correct degree of grief, and the peonies, indifferent to human sorrow, retreated into their roots and waited for spring. They bloomed the following year and the year after that, and they were still blooming decades later when Xian's children played in the garden. The memorial stone for Lady Shen stood beside them, and every year on the anniversary of Meilin's death, Xian would come and tell the story of his sister who had loved poetry and gardens, who had been brave when it mattered, who had taught him that legitimacy was earned through character, not merely inherited through birth. He never mentioned the poison. He never mentioned Lady Tang's crime. But he built a household where such things could not happen in darkness, where truth was valued even when inconvenient, where daughters were protected and honored. It was not justice precisely, but it was something. A legacy that bloomed perennially, like the peonies his mother had planted, like the memory of his sister who had chosen peace over revenge, life over bitterness, truth over the satisfying simplicity of hatred. And in its way, it was enough.